Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about securing the software supply chain. With us today is our guest, Garantir, our guest partner. Our speakers today will be from Thales. We have Paul Hampton. He's our Senior Product Manager. And our guest from Garantir is Karen Miller, Chief Architect. And so with that, I just want to let you know that you can pose your questions in the click the question mark at the top right-hand side of your screen. You can type your question in there and we'll address those at the end of the session. Thank you very much, and we'll go ahead and hand it off to Paul now.
Jen, thank you very much. And Kieran, thank you for joining us on our Bright Talk channel today. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I've obviously seen a couple of snippets of it as we've been preparing this, and I think there's some really interesting information here, and I'm really looking forward to listening to you. And so as we know, the topic for today is supply chain attacks, and really the best place to start, I think, is can you, Kieran, tell us exactly what is a supply chain attack, please?
Sure, yeah. A pleasure to be here, by the way. Thanks for having us. And yeah, we'll just get right into it. So a supply chain attack is one that compromises its victims by exploiting components of the victim's supply chain. So an example would be the attacker injects malware into legitimate-looking software that an organization uses, and that organization would eventually become a victim at some point after the software is installed or used.
Okay, so you mentioned software. Is it correct to say we're talking specifically about tech companies in this scenario then?
So tech companies are definitely the obvious ones that it applies to. But even if you don't consider your organization to be a tech company, the information likely still applies. So many non-tech companies still supply some sort of software that needs to be protected. For example, mobile applications, websites, and even internal tools such as Excel macros and PowerShell scripts.
Oh, as I suppose as low level or indeed as commonplace as that. So could you walk us through what an attack might look like, please, Kieran?
Absolutely. Before we can really understand the attack, though, we need to understand how software is produced. And every organization is unique, but most companies that produce software have some sort of CI/CD pipeline. And this process can be triggered in a number of ways, but it's most commonly triggered when a developer commits code to what's called the source code repository. And this triggers what is known as a build. And that's where a build server will download that source code. It'll compile it or build it. It'll then sign it, and then it'll run a battery of tests. And then it'll usually then upload those artifacts to some sort of artifact repository. And now what attackers want is to sign their malicious code using the supplier's signing key so that they can masquerade their malware as the supplier's legitimate software. And there are 4 main ways that we're going to talk about today to pull off this attack. So the first one is to compromise the signing key. So this is where they actually steal the signing key. So if an attacker can pull this off, they can sign anything they want on behalf of the organization. They can even sign things offline. So this is arguably the worst case scenario. Now, as a side note here, there's technically another way to do this where you can get a CA to sign a certificate to the attacker on their behalf, but that's not really the organization's fault. So we're intentionally omitting that for right now. The next attack is to compromise the build server. Even if the attacker can't steal the signing key, we'll say that is actually locked away properly. If they can compromise the build server that has access to use the key, they can use it to sign their malware. The third attack is just going further upstream, and that's where they inject the malware into the source code repository. This attack has the benefit of automatically being embedded with the rest of the supplier's application, but it also has a significant drawback from the attacker's perspective because it's very visible, and therefore it's harder for them to avoid detection. And then the fourth attack is just moving further up. It's an insider threat. So this is where a valid employee, presumably a developer or someone with similar elevated permissions, is the one pulling off the attack. This is usually combined with the previous attack in that the insider threat is the one committing the malware to the repository or somehow pulling off the attack.
So those four scenarios I think they're both interesting and scary, possibly in equal measure. Would you mind going back to the slide you had on build server compromise? I've read quite a lot recently, as I'm sure all of our audience have, about the recent SolarWinds attack. Is it this scenario that occurred with SolarWinds?
That's correct. So according to the SolarWinds SEC filing and the information you can find on their website as well, the vulnerability was introduced as a result of a compromise of the build system, and it was not present in the source code repository.
Okay, thank you. So I suppose the immediate question then is, what could you do to protect against this sort of attack?
Yeah, that is indeed the million-dollar question. So at a high level, you need to ensure that the source control repository is free of malware and ensure that what is being signed matches what is in the repository. That's very high level, though, of course. So the devil's in the details. So to protect the source code repository, we need to enforce stricter security controls when pushing code changes. Then we need to also be able to scan the code for quality. To protect signing, we need to protect the signing keys in a hardware security module, restrict access to those keys, and ensure whatever is being signed matches what's in the repository. So, by the way, Thales and Garantir, we do have a joint solution for controlling access to the source code repository, but today we're just focusing on the last four bullets here. So scanning, getting the keys in an HSM, restricting access, and ensuring that the code being signed matches what's in the repository. So assuming we can get these four controls in place, this is what the architecture looks like now. So this is just the previous slide of the build environment with the security controls in place. So access to the repository is strongly protected. Only code that is in the repository can be signed. So that's a critical aspect. The repository code is being scanned for malware, and the signing keys are protected in an HSM. So with all of this in place, there are two ways an attacker can get their malware signed. So they can either get help from one or more insider threats, or they have to bypass lots of security controls to get their malware into the repository, all while remaining undetected. So while these aren't impossible to achieve, these controls significantly raise the bar for attackers and increase the cost of the attack.
Thank you, Kieran. It's really interesting. Really nice to see it laid out so clearly in an architecture diagram like that. Very easy to get my head around quickly. I suppose one question or challenge for you, and something that I know I run into a lot when I'm speaking to customers. You talked about raising the bar on multiple controls. Is it the case that this then means there's a lot of challenges in implementing this in practice? As an easy example, what's the impact on something like performance, for example?
Yeah, no, you're right. In security, we talk a lot about what should be done without taking into consideration sometimes all the other restrictions. And so there are four practical considerations to take into account. So the first is that not all source code repositories support the advanced security controls like multi-factor authentication or device authentication. And while there is a simple solution for that particular one we're not going to focus on today. We're going to focus on the other three there. So the second issue is performance. So in the DevOps world, we've all heard it, speed is paramount, right? Speed is everything. So if you provide any solution that negatively impacts performance, it's not likely to gain widespread adoption. The third issue is kind of a critical one. We've talked about that we want to validate that what we're signing matches what's in the repository. But so far, we've only said we want to do that. We haven't stated how to do so. And the last issue is a pretty big one, actually. It's client-side support. And what we mean by that is, so build servers, they support a wide array of code types, right? So if you go look at enterprises, you'll see they're building code for Windows, for Java, things that deploy on Mac, RPM packages, and et cetera. And so any solution you provide has to, it's got to apply to all of these platforms. So we're going to talk first about performance. So when your signing keys are stored in an HSM, the sort of obvious or naive approach to code signing is to upload the code to a server that has access to the HSM, sign the code there, and then download the signed result. This approach consumes a lot of bandwidth, and it's therefore really slow, especially when the build server and the HSM are not co-located. It also exposes unnecessary security risk because allowing executable code to be uploaded to a server with access to the HSM is not the best way to do it. So a better approach is to use something called client-side hashing. So basically, when you're signing something, there are two steps. The first is to hash the data, and the second is to apply the private key, which finally produces the signature. Now, since the private key isn't needed in the first step, you can actually do that first step, the hashing of the data, on the client side before sending the data over the network to the HSM. Since the output of the hash function is small and it's fixed in length, even if you're signing like a 2 gigabyte file, the data sent over the network is kept to a minimum, roughly 256 bits. So you get really fast signing. And so this approach, it also has the added benefit that it reduces the attack surface, since you're only allowing the hash value to be sent as opposed to the entire executable code. So with that in place, we can now answer the main question, which is, how can we validate that what we are signing matches what's in the repository? So here we have the picture we had, the picture we had before, where we have a build server, and it wants to sign its code. It's in the build process, and it sends the hash of the data over the network. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. It sends the hash of the data over the network to the signing server, and is getting ready to offload that to the HSM for signing. Now, the signing server wants to do that check we've been talking about, which is it wants to know, is this a good hash? Meaning, is it something that actually comes from the source code repository? So what the signing server does is it actually reaches out to the source control repository, pulls the same source code, performs a deterministic build, and then computes the hash and sees, does the hashes match? And so if the hashes don't match, the signing server can refuse to sign the hash and send alerts to administrators of the system.
Thank you, Grant. A question for you. Could you expand a little bit for me on what you mean by deterministic builds? I assume for everything you've just described to work, the compiler would have to be producing the exact same result every time it compiles and sees the same code. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah,
that's correct. So deterministic builds are also called reproducible builds. Okay. They ensure that every time you build the same source code and you use the same tools, you'll get exactly the same result, sort of byte for byte. So there's a movement in the industry to move towards reproducible builds because it's generally accepted to be more secure. And many modern day compilers support deterministic builds, so it hasn't been a problem for us to deploying the solution. But yeah, good question.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a look at what this looks like actually in practice. So we're going to actually demo doing this whole validating the hash. And for the demo, we're going to be using our product, Garantir, integrated with Thales' Luna HSM. So now Garantir is a cryptographic platform that implements everything that we've discussed here today and some other features as well. So this demo, we're going to showcase the code signing and hash validation capabilities. So let me go ahead and pull up the So it cuts off my audio when I do the demonstration there. So what we first did there is the standard signing. So that's just a normal signing running, in this case, running sign tool. And as you'll see, we were able to sign something just ad hoc running the command. So we haven't enabled the hash validation yet. So we're going to go ahead and enable the hash validation and see how that impacts our ability to run signing commands. So now you'll notice that the signing failed. However, this didn't actually do the hash validation yet. So as you'll remember from the slides, the Garantir needs to actually be able to reach into the source control repository to do the deterministic build to compute the hash. And just by running the sign command on its own, we haven't instructed Garantir yet how to get those parameters. So how to eventually download the source code, we haven't provided that information yet. So we need to do that. And the way we do that is we set some environment variables during signing, which we have a script that does. So then when we run the script, it'll effectively run the same signing command with some environment variables set, and then Garantir can actually perform the hash validation. So this time the validation actually did occur and the hash mismatch was detected. And so the code signing process fails this time. And Garantir will also send an alert to the administrators of the system to let them know, hey, something's wrong here. I got a signing request. It doesn't match what's in the source code repository. You need to go check it out. And so the video will show that alert here.
Kieran, that was an interesting demo and great to watch in action. From, I suppose, casual observer perspective, it looked like signing slowed down a little bit when the hash validation was enabled. Is that because the source code downloading and the compilation activity that's required?
Yep, so that's correct. So to overcome this, Garantir supports two modes of hash validation, pre-sign and post-sign. And what you just saw was the pre-sign validation. Okay. So in pre-sign validation, Garantir first validates that the hash being signed matches what's in the repository before it signs anything, just as the name implies. If the hashes don't match, then nothing gets signed. In post-sign validation, Garantir immediately signs the data and then starts validation. So if the hashes end up not matching, Garantir will send an alert, but you still got it signed. So pre-sign is more secure, but it's slower. So we say it's best for, quarterly production release signing sort of thing. While post-sign validation, it has stronger performance, and it's therefore more suitable for the CI/CD pipeline. So let's see what post-sign validation looks like. So right there, we just changed the policy of the key from pre-sign to post-sign. That's all of that happened so far in the video. So you'll notice something different here. So this time when we ran the same script, it actually signed successfully and it did it immediately. And that's again because we're going in post-sign mode, which allows the signature to be generated first and then trigger the more detective control of validating the hash. So you'll notice something here. So similar to before, there was a validation message sent to the administrator, but this one has that additional text you see highlighted there, which says the signature for this request was generated prior to the validation failure being detected. In other words, just as a further FYI, we did sign this. So maybe take this a little more seriously because there's a valid signature out there for something that we detected an error for.
So, Kieran, I like the flexibility of having the pre and post options. Continuing my theme of asking you slightly difficult questions, what happens if instead the attacker injects the malicious code directly into the source code repository? From what I've seen, in that scenario, the hashes would end up matching, and so in this case, there's nothing for Garantir to detect. Is that fair?
Yeah, you understand it perfectly correctly. So if the malware is injected into the source code repository, then there would be no difference in the hash values, since that, the hash coming from the build server would come directly from the source repository. So validating the hash on its own would not detect any issue. But this is a significantly less attractive approach to attackers because it makes detection much more likely when the code is in the repository for every developer to see. So assuming you're following decent practices, doing code reviews and things like that, it should be caught. That said, Garantir does provide an additional layer of security for this scenario. So since Garantir had to retrieve the source and compile the binaries to perform the hash validation, it can also be configured to run static or dynamic analysis on the code as part of the validation. So let's go ahead and see that in action.
Okay, thank you.
So let me rewind that a little bit. So right there, you can see that we're actually injecting a SQL injection into this code base here. This is not a sort of a trivial vulnerability, but a vulnerability nonetheless. And what we're going to show is the first time, when just doing hash validation alone, when we commit this to the repository, the build server is not going to detect any issue. But then when we turn on the static analysis, we actually can detect this issue. So, as I said, we committed the issue to the repository. We ran the build. So this is using Team City as the build server here. And everything was successful, just as you asked in your question, right? Because the hash is matched, nothing was found. So now the next step will be, we're going to change that key policy that you've seen us doing as part of these demos to one that says, in addition to hash validation, please also run the static analysis. And then the result's going to be different. So as you can see now, when we change the policy and rerun the same build, the static analysis, it detects the issue and the build process fails. So that was, in that case, we were able to stop the build and detect the issue, even though the hashes still match. And of course, as always, we sent the notification to the admin saying, hey, there's a problem here, you should check it out. Notice here, though, it does not say the signature was already generated because this was done in pre-sign.
Thank you, Kieran. For me, that's really fascinating to see that even a compromised build server, compromised set of source code, still won't pass through the process and end up with a signature. There's at least a check there to say something's not quite right. Take a look. Another question for you. I noticed that what you just showed, which was the static analysis piece, that looked like it was happening in the pre-sign mode you mentioned in the previous demo. Can you do exactly the same thing in the post-sign mode so you can still get that high performance boost?
Yep. Yeah, so that's correct. That's exactly how that demo was done in pre-sign validation mode.
Okay.
But you could also just as easily use it in post-sign validation for higher performance. In fact, enterprises that are really performance sensitive can use this feature to go a step further by parallelizing tasks. So this is what a typical build process looks like, roughly like this. Some people have slightly different tasks that they do, but the general idea is the build's triggered, downloads the source, compiles it, runs some tests. There's usually some static analysis going on there. But if you'll recall, since Garantir had to make its own copy of the binaries in order to do the hash validation, and then we've also shown that it can run static analysis and other types of tests, you can actually use this to run things in parallel. So what ends up happening is it looks more like this. So Garantir can run some of these tasks in parallel for you, and the overall effect is that the time taken to complete the build goes down. So I should emphasize that the overall CPU time does not decrease, but the wall clock time, or the time a developer spends waiting for the build to complete, that does decrease.
Thank you. It's pretty fascinating. And so I think earlier you mentioned, obviously, client integrations are always a challenge, and we've talked about, obviously, the number of different clients the platform supports, but I noticed that all the demos were Windows-based. Can you do exactly the same things on the other platforms you mentioned as well?
Yep. So Garantir supports a large number of clients, and we provide all the cryptographic service providers to ensure that it works out the box on any platform and integrates with any standard tool. So we provide all the, on Windows, we provide the KSP, on Java, the JCE provider, et cetera.
Okay.
And while we've been focused on code signing, Garantir and Thales, the combined solution, can be used for several other use cases, such as TLS, SSH, document signing, and more. So if you're looking to support many use cases, but don't want to deploy and maintain multiple tools, the combined solution, it's a great option. And that's really the crux of it. So that getting that hash validation going is really what can protect you against a compromised build server, and provide a fair amount of protection for the enterprise.
Kieran, thank you. For me, that was really fascinating. I love seeing the demos. Obviously, they make it real, but the overall story in terms of protecting that pipeline is, as we've seen, really important, because if it gets compromised, very, very severe things can happen. But the process for protecting it is actually really fascinating. The number of options and pieces that you need to think about really eye-opening for me as you were walking through this. So thank you. Jen, you started us off, and I think you're going to close us out with any questions from the audience.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. Thanks for that the presentation and the demos. So we have a question. Somebody asked, what about if the malware inserted in source? What if the malware is inserted in the source code repository as a 0-day code?
Yeah, that's a pretty catastrophic event. So at that point, so you'd be very lucky if your static analyzers were actually able to pick that up. But what your goal is at that point is that you should still be doing code reviews, right? So every commit to the repository should be reviewed by at least one other developer. And so that's where you should be questioning when you see something that looks a little suspicious. So bringing that back to the, if we want to use the most recent one, SolarWinds attack, I believe it was either FireEye or one of the other companies did a really great analysis of the malware. And yes, while they did do a decent job of providing class names and all that meshed with the overall code style of the application, there was still a significant elevation of privileges and everything that the code needed. and that to any qualified developer should have been a code smell. And so if you're doing code reviews, that's your best way to prevent malware being injected in the source repository. Also, the last thing I'll say on that is once the malware is in the source repository, you have a far greater chance of detecting it at some point, as opposed to an attacker who just gets control of the build server, signs their thing, scrubs the log files, and leaves. It's really hard for you. If you didn't detect it right at that moment, to detect it after the fact is a very difficult thing. And that's why, in this case, it took so long that the attackers were able to sit in the network for so long undetected.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Thanks, Kieran. So does the solution work without using deterministic builds?
Yeah, good question. So technically what we talked about here was a combination of components, right? So the first component, getting your keys in the HSM, that's step number one. That does not require any deterministic builds or anything like that. And that should be the first part. The part that does require the deterministic or reproducible builds is the doing the hash validation. So doing it in the automated fashion that we're showing. Now, we also support manual validation, where you have a manual approval process and quorums of approvers who come in to approve the request. That in itself doesn't require deterministic builds. But what I would say, even independently of anything to do with Garantir, just in general, companies should look to start moving towards deterministic builds. In a lot of cases, there's compiler flags you can set to get that going, and it's a huge gain later on. Anyone that you can show an auditor or anyone that, hey, this is exactly the source code that produced that set of binaries. Without using deterministic builds, you can't really do that very easily.
Okay, let's see, another question. Is this still the recommended solution if we use different keys for production and non-production?
Good question. So yes, is the short answer. So if you're using different keys for production and non-production, I'm going to assume that your non-production keys do not chain up to a publicly trusted CA, but your production ones do. And that's usually the question on this line. So if my non-production ones don't chain up, do I really need to worry about those keys? And the answer is yes, you do. One is, even though those keys don't chain up to a publicly trusted root, they usually chain up to an internally trusted root. That means in some area of your enterprise, these keys are trusted and therefore can wreak havoc in that area. And so let me give an example. Let's say you're using an internal PKI, and this actually happens pretty often, and that internal PKI is actually trusted throughout the enterprise. So anyone who compromises the internal code signing key or the non-production one can still do damage inside your network. And so for that reason alone, you would want to protect those keys, still get them in the HSM, and still apply policy. The other thing is that if you don't put this solution like this in place, or any solution that does these features, and you just have the non-production keys sort of unmanaged, you would never know if you did have an attack in the network, right? So by putting this in place, you'll be able to find out, hey, I have someone attacking my system. Even if I don't care about my non-production keys as much, I still want to know that, hey, someone's attacking me, and I want to do something about it as soon as possible.
Okay, great. And I just want to remind everybody too, if you have a question, just please click the question mark at the top right of your screen and feel free to type us a question while we're going through these that we already have. Okay, Kieran, or this may be for Paul. Does Thales offer a sandbox solution to test the code after it's built?
Good question. No, we don't. So I suppose that once the code is built and obviously signed, the nature of that code is such that it could do, I suppose, almost anything, can run almost anywhere. And so trying to offer a sandbox for arbitrary code is something difficult indeed. What I suppose is possibly more interesting is separate validation of that binary once it's been built, or indeed after the fact validation as it moves into other environments, which absolutely is possible.
Yep, and I'll just tag on to that. So when we join our solution Garantir with Thales' Luna HSM, so it is a separate node within the Garantir infrastructure, which is used to test the final product. And so you can use like a containerized solution for that. You can even call third-party providers to do the analysis of the binaries if you want it at that point. And there are third-party providers that do, hey, I'm going to run this in a sandbox environment and tell you later on if there's a problem. So that part is very flexible. But the overall architecture is get your keys to the kingdom. Those are the code signing keys. Get them in the HSM, and then put this infrastructure around it that'll validate that what you're signing matches in your repository, and then you're free to run any tests you'd like as part of that process to validate those binaries.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And this one's for you, Karen, I think. Does this solution apply to other use cases other than code signing?
So technically, yeah, you could use it for document signing. So I did mention other use cases in the slide. So a lot of those other use cases, though, are using the HSM and Garantir to sign authentication mechanisms. So you're actually signing a challenge during the challenge response handshake. The hash validation would not apply there because there's no source of truth to go back to validate the hash. Whereas in the code signing case, we can actually go back to the source code repository, and that is the source of truth. In the SSH authentication or TLS authentication, there is no source of truth. However, the other parts still apply. Getting the keys in the HSM and putting this infrastructure in place on using those keys, that all would apply. Just the hash validation is really mostly applicable to code signing, and then can also be used for document signing. Okay,
excellent. I think that's it for the questions. We had one more that somebody had asked if we were going to share the presentation. There'll definitely be a recording of this session on demand on the Bright Talk channel. We can put some details, some more information in the resources information of that recording. So with that, I guess we will wrap it up a little bit early. Give you all a few minutes back to your day. We really appreciate everybody joining us for this session and encourage you to go check out other webinars on our Bright Talk channel. So thank you very much to Karen and Paul, and everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Kieran. Appreciate you presenting.